Hello and welcome back to the Marvellous History of Medicine podcast, the show where we dive into the curious, courageous, and occasionally catastrophic tales of medical history. Today, we're stepping into the world of a man who was too brilliant, too observant, and we might arguably say too morally principled to work as a doctor during his time and place. His name, Thomas Hodgkin, doctor, reformer, idealist, Quaker, an unwitting namesake of a cancer he didn't even know was cancer. Why? Because it's a pretty tough gig to wind up being known almost 200 years after your death as the name associated with a particular cancer. Today's question is that a fair reflection of Thomas Hodgkin, the man? Or is he worth getting to know a little more intimately? Obviously, as you'll have gathered from my intro, I think he is. But before we get to lymph nodes and microscopes, let's set the stage. The world of 1832. It's 1832, and we find ourselves in early Victorian Britain. London is filthy, loud, overcrowded, full of horse shit, and there's a huge cholera epidemic ripping through the city, so that's grand. Keeps doctors in a job, I suppose. Elsewhere, Charles Darwin's sailing aboard the HMS Beagle. Not yet a household name, but off taking an interest in stuff in South America. The first public passenger railway has already opened, with the Stockton and Darlington Railway accepting passenger fares since 1825. The first trip appears not to have been delayed, as there was no timetable, but it averaged 8 miles per hour and was hindered by a derailed wagon. How little things have changed. The Slavery Abolition Act is set to be passed in 1833, outlawing slavery throughout the British Empire. And medicine? Well, it's part science, part guesswork, and 64.8% being a well-to-do white man with excellent sideburns or moustache. Microscopes are primitive, pathology is still new, germs aren't yet known about, most diseases are diagnosed by feeling lumps, sniffing patients, and hoping no one dies on the examination table. Into this chaotic world steps a young Quaker doctor with a talent for observation and a moral compass made of steel. Thomas Hodgkin was born in 1798 into a devout Quaker family. Quakers believe in equality, compassion, and doing the right thing, even when it's profoundly inconvenient. This worldview will go on to define Hodgkin's entire life and career. And side note, it should come as no surprise that almost all the early abolitionists in the UK were Quakers. Anyways, that Thomas Hodgkin. He goes on to train at Guy's Hospital in London and quickly becomes known amongst his peers for two things. One, he's a very good pathologist, or great at slicing and dicing and looking at things under microscopes. And two, he has lots of opinions, and he holds on to them tightly. They concern how society should treat its poor, its enslaved, and its colonized peoples, and he won't stop going on about them. Thomas Hodgkin attends the lectures of prominent surgeon Sir Astley Cooper, who gets a pretty good stint on the mic in our episode on heroic medicine. Thomas Hodgkin then up sticks, first to Edinburgh and then France, where he learns to use a stethoscope, a recent invention by René Laennec, and he learns the precise statistical methods and clinical approach to reviewing whether a treatment is actually good or bad for the patients under Pierre-Charles Alexandre Louis, one of the preeminent figures in the long evidence-based campaign against bloodletting. In 1825, Hodgkin moves back from Paris to London. He gets a position as a volunteer clerk at Guy's Hospital before becoming the museum curator and also carrying out autopsies. He becomes reputable for his knowledge in what was then called morbid anatomy, but that we would now recognize as anatomical pathology. Hodgkin goes about being a man of principles and charity all over again. He advocates for public health decades before it becomes fashionable, and a century before the NHS is a thing. He campaigns for clean water, better housing, and vaccination. He rails against colonial exploitation. He helps found what will go on to become the Anti-Slavery Society. He is, to put it mildly, not your average Victorian physician. We move to 1832, the year Hodgkin presents a paper to the Medical and Chirurgical Society of London, titled On Some Morbid Appearances of the Absorbent Glands and Spleen. Catchy. In this paper, Hodgkin describes 7 patients whose lymph nodes and spleens were massively enlarged for reasons no one understood. They weren't infected, and they weren't suffering the usual fevers. Something new or unobserved was being noticed for the very first time. Hodgkin doesn't call it cancer. He doesn't understand the mechanism of cancer. But what he does do is describe the disease with such clarity that future pathologists, when they're discovering cancer later on, will recognize instantly these 7 cases as exactly the same as what they're looking at. Hodgkin is basically the first to say, hey, this particular constellation of lumps and bumps, it's its own thing. But at the time, no one pays attention. The paper sinks with barely a ripple made in terms of medical establishment acknowledgement. The contemporary men of medicine have better things to do: bloodletting, opium, and not washing their hands, because, well, the concept of germs is still alien and unknown. Roll on the mid-1830s, and Hodgkin becomes the man too principled to keep his own job. Despite making good progress climbing the ranks at Guy's Hospital, because he's talented, respected, and diligent and hard-working, he is then unceremoniously fired. Why? Hodgkin objects loudly and repeatedly to the hospital's plan to expand private expensive wards for the wealthy instead of investing in care for the poor. He writes letters, he protests, and he refuses to back down. Guy's Hospital decides it's easier to get rid of this man of conscience than address the moral failings he's lambasting. Hodgkin loses his career for advocating universal healthcare in the 1830s, a man way ahead of his time. Then the rediscovery of his paper. Fast forward to the 1850s, another pathologist, Samuel Wilkes, is studying patients with the same strange disease and realizes that somebody else described it decades earlier, and maybe described it a little better. Wilkes declares, "This is Hodgkin's disease." Finally, Hodgkin gets credit for his insight, although he died 2 years later and never knew his name would become synonymous with the disorder. Later, with the development of microscopy and advances in pathology, Hodgkin's disease is reclassified as a lymphoma, or a cancer of the lymphatic system. Today, Hodgkin lymphoma is highly treatable and has one of the best cancer prognoses, and it all traces back to 7 carefully described patients in 1832. Hodgkin's meticulous observation laid the groundwork for important scientific research that's gone on to save many lives long after Thomas Hodgkin was gone. But what did he do next? What did he do with the rest of his life? Well, after losing his post at Guy's Hospital, Hodgkin devotes himself to humanitarian activism. He campaigns for indigenous rights across the British Empire, especially in Canada and North Africa. He mentors explorers like James Bakehouse. He advocates tirelessly against slavery, poverty, and inequality. And then he dies in 1866 in Jaffa, modern-day Tel Aviv, while helping establish medical support for travellers and the local community. He's buried there. His tombstone bears a simple inscription chosen by his friends, quote, "Nothing of humanity was foreign to him," end quote. How many doctors, or humans for that matter, could honestly claim that, or would have their friends claim it for them? Thomas Hodgkin's contributions to medicine weren't limited to the disease that took his name. He was one of the founders of modern pathology. He was an early champion of preventative medicine, and he was a relentless advocate for social justice. And that's the marvellous and morally uncompromising history of Thomas Hodgkin, the physician who saw patterns no one else cared to see, cared about people nobody else saw, and left a legacy far larger than he ever imagined. If you've enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend, leave a review, or simply whisper lymph nodes into the void. We appreciate all forms of feedback here at the Marvellous History of Medicine podcast, and I hope that you join me for another strange, surprising, and splendid tale from the history of healing soon. Thank you.